This is Nan McKay, and I would like to introduce you today to William Lilley. He is referred to as Bill. Bill taught at Yale, where he received his Ph.D. for most of the 1960s. His fields were American history and American studies. He worked in the federal government for all of the 1970s. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Department of Housing and Urban Development, then Acting Director of the Council on Wage and Price Stability, and then Staff Director of the Budget Committee of the House of Representatives. Bill also worked in the private sector for the remainder of his career. He started at CBS, the media company in New York, where he directed for the 1980s the company's external affairs with government, media, and investment analysts. He left CBS to found his own software company called iMapData, which built an extensive library of databases that could be visualized on a web-based platform. And clients could merge their own data with iMap's data and see anomalies in their performance. His interests centered on the political and economic development of the American West in the 19th century. He co-authored an article analyzing why so many of the irrigation ventures in the 19th century West were failures. And he has published a new book, which we will find out about. So welcome, Bill Lilley.
Thank you very much, man.
Now, Bill, you were chosen as a Fellow of American Academy of Housing and Communities for your influence on housing and communities, which is quite an honor. Your career has been full of variety. You started out teaching at Yale, and from your interest in the American West, it seems like you were in the career of your choice. Why did you decide to leave teaching and go to work in the federal government?
Man, I had formed a friendship when I was at Yale in the 60s with a scholar at Harvard, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who in 1963, when I was a graduate student, had written a book called Beyond the Melting Pot about different ethnic and racial groups trying to assimilate with each other in New York City. And he and I had become very close, and he had said that if he ever got into the government, he would try to find out if there was a job for me and bring me to Washington from New Haven. He taught at Harvard. And he went on to become Director of Domestic Policy under Nixon and served for the first administration as Nixon's Director of Domestic Policy. He asked me at the end of the first administration if I would come into the administration, and he put me together with Jim Lynn, who had just been nominated to be Secretary of HUD. And Jim interviewed me, and with Pat's blessing, I took a leave of teaching and went into the government. That's a long story, sorry.
So you always kind of had an interest in that area.
I had taught a course at Yale in urban affairs, and why some cities were declining and others were growing, and why some ethnic groups were prospering and some declining. And I was particularly interested in why certain neighborhoods grew in cities and others declined. And it was always in retrospect, man, it's easy to predict that so-and-so with Georgetown, Washington, D.C. was going to boom, but it wasn't necessarily that way. And the same for Capitol Hill. So there's always been a search. It's kind of the holy grail in urban studies. What neighborhoods are going to do well? What's going to make them do well? What makes certain neighborhoods go downhill?
And you decided to get out of the academic and the theoretical and do something that was active in policy development. Is that right?
That is correct. I never thought it was going to be at HUD, which turned out to be a lot rougher place than Yale and New Haven.
Now, you were Deputy Assistant Secretary for HUD in the 1970s, and you said Jim Lynn was the HUD Secretary.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about some of your colleagues at HUD that you admired, both maybe political appointees and the career civil servants.
Well, let me start by saying that when I went into HUD, it was at the beginning of Nixon's second administration. He was not yet in Watergate difficulties. And he had a grand plan that Moynihan had structured that HUD, transportation, parts of interior, and parts of agriculture would be all pushed together into a Department of Community Development. And HUD would be the lead agency, and Jim Lynn would be the secretary of the massive agency. And Mike Moscow, a close friend, would be the assistant secretary for policy development for this huge Department of Community Development, and I would be the deputy assistant secretary. So things started at a very grand level. And I had the opportunity to meet in my first days with Dan Carney, who was the deputy assistant, my counterpart in the housing sector of the department, Shel Lugar, who was the commissioner of the FHA and the assistant secretary for housing. A wonderful person. Dan came from Illinois. He'd been director of the Illinois Housing Agency. Shel came from Milwaukee, where his company that he had built up was the leading mortgage lender in that part of Wisconsin. Also Mike Moscow. So there's Carney, Lugar, Mike Moscow, who was an economist in labor economics, had been on the Council of Economic Advisors staff. And lastly, Rudy Penner, who had left the Congressional Budget Office where he was the director and came to HUD with the four of us, and we became sort of four musketeers that were all pushed together by Jim Lynn. And you know, a great debt of thanks. He was a wonderful man to work with. That's my story.
Tell us about the threats on HUD's existence and troubled programs at that time.
Well, this is the beginning. This was the end of 1972, the beginning of 1973. And because Nixon had tapped Lynn to be the head of HUD and the head of this Department of Community Development, bureaucratically, HUD was kind of insulated because it had a star secretary. But HUD at that time was in probably its worst patch of trouble. It had been founded in 1968. It was Johnson's great dream of the Great Society, and that HUD would be the center point for urban development throughout the United States. Some of the programs, which were all written with great intent, good intent, and had very talented people working for them, the programs themselves had inherent flaws in them. Public housing took a downturn in the beginning of the 70s. High vacancy rates were occurring in many of the projects, and we were faced with waves of vandalism. In certain situations, where gang control by kids had become prevalent in the units, we had had to actually destroy the units because the neighborhoods were vociferous against these projects for triggering violence. And then we had a string of programs that subsidized the building of single-family housing and multifamily housing. The people who took those mortgages under subsidy did not stay current with their mortgages and HUD foreclosed on those mortgages. And in some cities, there were so many that were foreclosed that HUD was the biggest landlord in the city. And in Detroit, for example, over 20% of the properties were owned by HUD. So Nixon, who was taking a lot of criticism for this, took a very draconian step. And when I entered HUD, he suspended, not that I mattered, he suspended all the housing programs, and HUD was basically shut down. And Jim Lynn was told by Moynihan and by Nixon to make a study of these programs, find out what was wrong with them, and cure them before they were reconvened and started again. So it was a very delicate situation. If the department had been shut down, it was challenged legally, but it was shut down. And in this study, and I was the director of the study, was day-to-day operations. The head writers of it were my friends Carney, Lumar, Moscow, and Penner. So we were the housing study. And people expected a lot of us, so I'm not sure. We thought we did the best we could. That's my story.
I remember the Nixon moratorium in about 1972. And that's the time, if I remember right, that Pruitt-Igoe was one of the buildings that you're talking about.
That is correct. We had to destroy that.
And that was in St. Louis. And then also there were problems with Chicago at that time, weren't there?
That is right. You know your projects. Mike Moscow and I toured the Cabrini Green projects on South Street. It's the roughest place I've ever been in. We were taken in by guards. We were white guys, and African Americans were mostly in the project. It was the toughest place I have ever been in. The ceiling or the roof, if you went up on the top of the building, was covered over with a cage, so that things could not be thrown off the top of the projects. We were escorted by guards with guns. There were no adult males in the project. The strip of housing projects that we were in on State Street were run by the Blackstone Rangers, which were a gang, and they controlled the Cabrini Green block of projects. And another gang called the Crips ran the Robert Taylor projects north of the Cabrini Green. It was a very bad situation.
And many of the people who lived there in fear because the gangs had taken over. And I think didn't they have to pay some money to the gangs in order to stay safe?
Well, we were told that, and we asked people, we were cleared by the internal people, and the cops who took us in, I don't know this for sure, but it seemed to me that there was a camaraderie between the gang inside the project and the cops who were supposed to be policing. They would make an arrangement, and Mike Moscow and I were allowed to go in and see. We'd never been in a public housing room in Chicago. It was our first time to see what a building looked like inside. Because the tenants complained that they were safe and that HUD had let them down. So we wanted to see if they were safe. We went into a number of areas. Often, we found that the rooms that we went into that were kind of like cleared rooms for feds like Mike and me were full of television sets, high fidelity equipment, it's still in boxes. And we have no evidence of this, but it looked like these project homes were sort of middle grounds or fences for electronic equipment that was being sold. It was if you'd grown up in the suburbs of Philadelphia like I did, it was an awakening to go to the projects in Chicago.
Well, I do have to say that that was true in those somewhat isolated cases, because back then I was managing an elderly high-rise that had been built in Minnesota, and it was extremely successful and a great place to live. So the problem oftentimes was in the larger cities, and those kinds of situations really were not necessarily pervasive outside of those big cities. The problem was that that set the tone for what public housing is, because it was publicized back then.
Well, you're right. One of the things we dealt with in our study was that we had a major anomaly on your hands. We were charged to find out what was wrong here. Something was obviously wrong in Chicago. Something was wrong in Philadelphia. We went there. In Atlanta, we went there. San Francisco. Problem, problem, problem. But we had as many projects, particularly in the South and the Midwest, for elderly people that were triumphs, just well run. The tenants loved living there. They felt safe. They had camaraderie. The people that managed them were managers. They knew what they were doing. And we always had this curious, not one and one not adding up to two, because you had the project in St. Louis, which was a mess. The median age was 13 years old in the project, whereas you would have elderly projects that were just wonderful. And the trouble was, when you shut down public housing, you shut down the good ones along with the bad ones. But you couldn't blame the people in the Atlanta projects. It wasn't their fault. These were little kids in many places. It was a mess. It was Pat Moynihan was vociferous about public housing. It was one of the worst projects. Urban renewal and public housing were two things that the feds should not be doing. But that was what he had said before he went to the government.
Well, and as you said, everything got lumped together into one, that the Fed shouldn't be involved in urban renewal and public housing, but the reality is it was successful in many, many places. And so that's the problem that we constantly had faced, is that it seems like we were always lumped in together. And part of the problem, I think, Bill, was really the design of the buildings, especially in those large cities, because there were often high rises and with elevators, but maybe we had, you had 18 stories of a high rise, and we ended up with children in the high rise that had to take the elevators up and down. That was a problem. And then there was no green space around for anybody to do any playing. It wasn't like a nice, friendly family development in its original design.
Well, that Pruitt-Igoe that you mentioned in St. Louis, which won architectural awards for its design, and they used it was called the brutalist design, and HUD is built in that fashion too. The building on 7th Street in Washington, D.C., of concrete, very, very rough looking. The high rise where the elevators become a magnet for crime,
right,
for things that went wrong. There wasn't the staff on hand to fix these kinds of problems. I think, in looking at what you said, when HUD scaled up these projects, when you had 44 consecutive blocks of public housing on State Street in South Chicago, you're asking for trouble. You don't put 44 blocks of all the same people together in one place and not expect something to go wrong. The world isn't designed that way. And this, it took a look. If you had computerized Chicago and had a red dot for where people in public housing live, and you put them on the map, you can see a cluster of people that were being warehoused on South Street, so on State Street and the South Side, and we inherited the problems from that. It was the people that started these projects, that ran them, public housing, particularly in the South, which had a long historical tradition of public housing, things worked right where you had the right people there. But when you got these massive projects, New York City, where they had the huge ones, up on 96th Street, it was too much. It was like a big company that got too big. And, but
So how did the task force address some of the issues? You said that in some cases, they actually tore the buildings down, demolished the buildings. And then we had some Hope 6 at some point that relocated people into smaller units that were developed. But how else did the task force address some of these issues that you're talking about?
Our major thrust, and this came from principally Dan Carney and Rudy Penner. Rudy Penner was running, at the same time he was working on the housing study, he was running under Jim Lynn's direction our study of housing allowances that we had going on in 9 different markets, the most successful one being Jacksonville, and I will return there. And we were looking to see how if you gave people cash and let them market them, search themselves in a market, but the market didn't have to be big and they didn't have to be congregated, how it would work. And we found in certain cities, this goes back to what you said, that weren't big cities. Jacksonville was a perfect size. Pittsburgh was another success, where there are mid-sized cities. And we decided in the housing study to stop as a department building new projects and instead give tenants a voucher or something that was now called Section 8, where you would go in with your money to pay the rent, but you would use existing housing in the marketplace. A problem that we found was that a government, unlike a builder like Shell Newbar did, a government like HUD had many goals: civil rights, environment, safety. I could name maybe 10 of them. And at the same time, affordable housing. Well, you can't serve 10 masters at once, where someone in the market can build something like the project you ran that you mentioned in Minnesota was built to be a successful housing project. And you subjugated other priorities underneath that to get those tenants safe and happy in a project, and not worry about whether, you're not despoiling the environment, but you weren't asking to have it be an environmental award at the same time that it was a housing award. So it was very hard for the federal government. Housing is a very complicated business. And it's hard enough to do something in housing. You have to do 3 things at the same time. And Lynn wanted the department out of building, out of the responsibility of serving all these goals at the same time, which were good goals. It was a 10-ton truck or a 1-ton truck carrying truck. I hope I made myself clear on that.
And never enough money, it seems like, to go around to maintain what they had done.
Well, exactly. We were under a ceiling from our House Appropriations Committee. It was chaired by a man named Eddie Boland. He was one of the nicest people I ever dealt with. He was from Worcester, Massachusetts. And he had a big problem with violence in his public housing projects. And he had put us under strict rules that these projects had to be safe. And we had to build things especially secure. And that cost money. And we were running over the ceiling that his subcommittee had put in place. That we couldn't make the door as secure as it had to be and not run over on costs on the side of the wall where the door was. It's a small thing, but it was the little thing with the door that meant the door itself had to be bigger, and the wall had to be wider, and each ratchet drove up the cost. And Congress solved the problem by allowing us a waiver that we could override costs by the amount the safe door costs. You can't keep building a place like that, where you're building it for $50, but you can build it for $100 if you spend the extra $50 on the doorknob. It's a very tough, but public housing, the New York Times once a year, and I've been out of government since the 1970s, once a year has an article on how the public housing projects in New York City are in bad shape and how there is still lead-based paint in all of the projects. And I laugh. I'm saying they ought to keep that article in a can. And every year when they're going to run that story, just rerun the same story. You don't have to research it. It's just the way that business is.
Bill, were you involved in Operation Breakthrough?
Operation Breakthrough was run by Harry Fager, who Mike Moscow inherited Harry's job when George Romney was Secretary of HUD. Romney was a wonderful fellow, an expert in industrial production. He'd been successful head of American Motors. And he had this belief, Harry was out of MIT, an engineer, that home building could be taken out of the way it was built by home builders. And then companies like car companies like his company could make housing. And they could streamline it and cut the costs as much as 50%. And Romney talked with the National Association of Home Builders, which is the big trade association in Washington. They have thousands of members, very strong trade association. And if you're a home builder, you want to belong to the National Association of Home Builders. And the average number of units per year that a home builder builds is 7 units. And that's not a lot of housing. So it's very hard if you want to accelerate housing or lower its costs. There's not one lever you can push. If you've got everyone making 7 houses, and he had tried this, and he left government, and we came in as his successors. And Harry Fager went back, I think he was at MIT, went back to MIT. So we had their staff, which were very talented people. A man named Arthur Newberg, I believe, was running that shop. And they had built projects around the country where they were able to build housing in under 6 months, cut the cost dramatically, was good looking. The question was, which we found out, was that was more new housing the problem in housing. And the answer that we thought was no, that the existing stock could be fixed up. And you can serve with money 4 families in existing stock for every 1 family you put into a new housing unit. So that all of us on the team, the housing team, under Lynn had training in economics. And we thought our mission was to serve more people rather than have better housing. We weren't against better housing, but we wanted more people in safe and secure housing. And that, when you go that route, if you want to serve more people, you end up going to housing allowance, Section 8 route, because it enables you to help more people.
Which actually is now the biggest program for subsidy in the country.
That is correct.
Back then, well, in fact, we do have a podcast of Harry Finger. Back then, was Dwight Inc. involved at all?
I believe Dwight Inc. was part of that team.
Because we also have a podcast with Dwight Inc. and he's about 97 now.
Well, he was a legendary bureaucrat. Legendary.
Yes, yes, in many different areas.
Oh, yes.
Well, what were you involved in your role as acting director of the Council on Wage and Price Stability?
Well, this was the Ford administration. And if high inflation was a big problem during the Ford administration. And one of the causes of high inflation, economists believe, was that certain regulations by federal and state governments were in place, which were driving up the costs of goods and services. And the Council on Wage and Price Stability was created by Ford. It was his first act as president. And it gave the council the power to intervene in a regulatory proceeding which we deemed to be inflationary. And therefore we could enter a proceeding, we could ask for hearings, we could ask for data from the federal agency, and we could look at what they were doing. Our challenge was, could you do the same thing and get to where they were going, but do it in a different way? And there were 2 schools of thought at war. A regulator, particularly somebody at the Environmental Protection Agency or the Department of Labor, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, they are devoted to the process of cleaning up the environment, of making the air better, the water better, the lawnmower safer, making of steel safer. Our goal was not to tell them how to do it, but to ask them to get it done, but set up performance standards where the companies themselves or the labor unions would devise their own way of meeting the goal. Because we found that the people on the ground knew more about what they were doing than somebody working in a building in Washington, D.C. And it seems self-evident now that it was considered radical at the time that you were in effect you were pricing people's lives by finding cheaper ways to do things. And I remember in the Water Pollution Act, we were in power, we weren't in power, we were in office, I'll take that back. When there was the major amendments to the Water Pollution Act, when they ordered that water in the rivers and streams go from 93% purity to 97%. And we found that it cost 50% as much to go from 93 to 97 as it had cost to go from 0 to 93. So the incremental pieces that you were going, the holy grail of perfection, was very expensive. And we were charging an enormous amount just to go, if we go just to 95, it would have been a large amount. So we were regulating the regulators. It was every day was a struggle. And I had mostly economists working for me. And at the EPA, where we were often in hearings or other things, the people were dedicated environmentalists, and the meetings would be very hostile, a lot of animosity on both sides. And it was difficult for me as a director, meeting with the assistant secretary of his people, for us to find, we couldn't, if we were just going to fight, we'd never get anywhere. But the economists and the regulators, they wanted to get at each other's throats. So those were the most interesting days.
Now, you also were staff director of the Budget Committee of the House of Representatives. And what did that entail, and how did that impact HUD, if it did?
Well, that's a very good question, because I don't think HUD fared very well. Nixon had started something with Moynihan that the way the government budgeted, it was budgeting offices. The Department of Agriculture has a budget. HHS has a budget. HUD has a budget. Well, in the Greek word of bureaucracy, which we were funding, bureaucracy means offices. That's where the word came from. And Moynihan's position was that you shouldn't fund offices, you should fund functions. That seems simple now and obvious, but very difficult. What he had persuaded Nixon to agree to do with the Department of Community Development was to take out of all the agencies that were in the housing business and put them in one agency. We shouldn't have had the Department of Interior in Indian housing. We shouldn't have had the Department of Agriculture in rural housing. All of this should be consolidated and run as by housing experts, not by bureaucratic experts, but by housing experts. It seems obvious now, self-evident. And then when the budget process started up on the Hill was more convinced than the executive branch that they funded bureaucracies. They funded the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard had relationships with the subcommittee. Well, the way the budget is drawn up was drawn up into 10 different functions in the budget process. Community development is a function. National security is a function. Now, when you do that, you subjugate HUD. It becomes part of a function. But they were asking the right question: how much is the government spending on housing? Not how much is the agriculture department spending on housing, or the land, Bureau of Land Management, but how much is being spent on housing altogether. It was an impossible task to get. The Congress, who often criticizes the executive branch for being bureaucrats, are as bureaucratic about their turf when it comes to protecting the money that they spend for Indian housing as the Eddie Bowen subcommittee was for putting money into public housing in Worcester, Massachusetts. So the congressmen who criticize the bureaucrats are themselves mirror bureaucrats. And I do not think it's changed much today from my day. And the budget will continue to spiral on and on, because there's no way to measure whether you're spending cost effectively because your spending is so scattered. Yeah.
That's a very interesting observation. Well, why did you decide to leave government and go to CBS? And I'm kind of wondering, what did you find most interesting about that job?
What if I told you the real reason? What would you think of me?
I would think whatever you want.
What if what if it was you were putting your children through college?
Money, 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 money.
Money, money, money. Um, and my job at CBS was a high-level job. Um, and I got to see things and learn things. This was the 1980s. There were only 3 television networks in existence then, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And CBS was the lead network. So it was a terrific job. And I got to see the role that media played, and the people within the media played on people's lives. And I got to see the power. I just come from HUD and places like that, where congressmen and a person like Jim Lynn could think that they had power locally. Well, the power then in the 1980s of the local television stations was enormous. I remember the best lesson I got was the weatherman for our, we had a station in New York City, Channel 2, a big station. And we had a very popular weatherman who came on the 11 o'clock time frame. And he used to make the wildest weather projections I ever heard. He was amazingly popular. His ratings were through the roof. The terrible storms never came, but everyone watched them. And Saturday Night Live used to do skits about it. He finally had to be let go, and the ratings crashed on the channel because people loved what he was doing. And I've always thought, I forget his name, but it was the power of the channel and the way he did it that brought him those ratings. And here was the biggest market in the country, and he had the biggest weather following. That's a little thing, the weather, but it makes other people stay for the local news, local sports. Now that's a silly example, but it's a great thing to be involved in something that matters to an enormous number of people, and to see how, if you do something right, and CBS is very proud of itself for putting on shows that were considered constructed. The CBS News Division was the best news division, but there was the weatherman. And when I think back on those days, I always think of the weatherman.
And then after all that, you decide to start your own software company. And this seems like an odd segue since I'm not hearing about any background in software. How and why did you get interested in this?
Well, I learned at CBS and HUD and the other jobs I had that people tend to look at whatever they're doing. They look at it within a windshield that their job has created for them. When I came to HUD, Romney had put in place for every state an area office director where his responsibilities were. And there were several urban areas and the suburbs around him. His whole life was this windshield of this area office geography. That was what his interest was. I had learned that when I was an academic, that there's a huge amount of data that's free that you can have. And if you can put that data into a windshield area that the person understands, you can understand things that you didn't see before. And for our company, we created for everyone that was a client was the windshield that mattered. Let's take Anheuser-Busch for a minute. It's a beer company. Anheuser-Busch runs itself by the geographic terrain of 109 wholesaler districts. They create Anheuser-Busch wholesalers, and they have the monopoly in that area on Anheuser on Budweiser product. Now, those areas are not states or counties. They're areas that the Budweiser people have created that make sense to them for people, for personal relationships, and what the area should be. But in software terminology, the areas were not digitized. If they did not have a circle of longitudinal and latitudinal points circumscribing the district that could be put onto a map, a windshield. So we digitized the 109 areas. And then we put in data that they didn't know about. Like, where was every college town in the United States? Well, college towns are big consumers of Anheuser-Busch product. And they have a whole marketing arm that they loan out to the wholesalers to go. But Anheuser-Busch and the college towns weren't linked up with the wholesaler districts. And we were able in a millisecond to drop into every wholesaler district where there would be disproportionate consumption of their beer. And they could use, because Budweiser had cooperative advertising already arranged and put in place for the college town. So that's a little example of by creating the person's windshield, and then you put in that the data that's available. Like, HUD operates the same way. You just have to give the person, take model cities, a project that we inherited from the Great Society. Model cities are areas of cities. And the mayor was supposed to fix up that area and make it a model city. Well, the areas outside of that envelope didn't matter. It was the model city part that did. But you had to know where it was. So that was what we did. And it worked.
Tell me about the National Journal, which you co-founded, and your book, Francis Newland's and the Improbable Quest to Irrigate the West, which was published in 2020 through Stanford University.
Correct. Well, when I was at Yale, I actually got to know Moynihan through a student who was the sole nephew of a man named Nathan Glazer, who was co-author with Moynihan of Beyond the Building Project. Through this student, I had gotten to know Moynihan. And that had started the whole, and I had found just dealing with Moynihan and teaching my courses on urban affairs at Yale. Actually, it was one seminar over there. I found that Moynihan believed that the media covered government mostly in the Congress. And what was legislated was what people thought government was. And Pat believed that it was the executive branch and that regulations were the most important. And he had talked to a number of people about this. In National Journal, 5 people that were all Yale's started, well, no, 2 were Yale's, started a magazine that focused on what the executive branch did. And for a year and a half, I had the HUD beat. There were articles on HUD. And when I was notified, when Jim Lynn was notified by Moynihan about me, I met Lynn to be examined. And he had a book where he'd taken all my National Journal articles on HUD, and he had it in front of him. was an embarrassing experience, and he quizzed me about my articles. And I had instances where I'd forgotten what I'd written. And I can remember saying to him, I said, who said that? And he said, you did. And I said, no. And he ran a restaurant, and he took the book and showed me where he marked it up, and I'd written it down. But nobody had covered HUD before. I had a little spare office I could go there and take my notes. And I got to know Romney through that and learned about Operation Breakthrough. In fact, I had interviewed Romney for my piece on the National Association of Home Builders. That's where Romney learned that there were 7 units per home builder. So National Journal started that way. And I was able to continue my work at Yale and then just move into the government from there. And you asked me about my book when I was at Yale. Yale has always been the Eastern College leader in Western American history and has a large collection of manuscripts and maps and other material relating to the West. And I had done my dissertation on the formation of the National Reclamation Act, which was passed in 1902, which is the only act that Congress ever passed which benefits just the West, just one region of the country. And so I rewrote my dissertation, and Stanford was good enough to publish it.
Would you call that your legacy, or what would you consider your legacy and why?
Oh, my legacy. Well, I can only add, in a very selfish way, I'll have to say what I've left myself. And HUD is, I think of HUD in those days. We worked very hard, had long hours, it was tough. We were unpopular because the housing program was suspended. But we had a great time doing it. We learned things about human nature, about government. And I think the legacy is that I always was doing something interesting. And even if you got a hard time for doing it, it was still worthwhile and interesting. So I would wonder if you asked my colleagues at HUD what they would say.
That's always a good question. What advice would you have for people in their 20s?
Oh, that's simple. I would tell kids in their 20s, don't listen to the media. I've been there, I've been inside the beast. The people that are working in the media, they don't know anything about anything more than you do. I know them, I've been there. They know very little about the economy and how it works. CBS is one of the biggest clients of my company. Not because they were ignorant, but because they needed the information. And don't, just because the media says that people are bad, that people are more racially hostile. Now, I don't necessarily agree with it that things are worse now. And I think you've got a chance. If you go to a good college and you work hard, you come out, you'll do just fine. I'm on a board at Stanford that deals with the American West. And we run an internship program where students that are gifted, they're all gifted at Stanford, go out with the help of Stanford and work on projects around the country in the western part of the country. I talked to a woman, a junior, a female, who'd gone to the Blackfeet Indian Reservation in Montana. And she and a colleague from Stanford They had helped Blackfeet prepare for annual adjudications over water rights with the Department of Interior. Every year they lost because the Department of Interior had lawyers and the Blackfeet didn't have any lawyers. The students went out and they built a balsa wood model of where the original grants were given them, the water rights. And then they built a comparative model of where their rights were now. And you can see in the two models how the rights had drifted away from the Indians over to the Department of Interior. The two kids won 2 of the 5 adjudications. The first time the Indians had ever won an adjudication. And my point of the story is, I asked the woman, I said, what impact did all this work have on you? And she was a small girl, and she said, I'll never be the same person again. It changed my life. And I thought of that, and I've taken away her telling me that when you ask me that question, what do you want to tell people now? College is offering you the chance to do things. And she said that her life will never be the same. Now, Stanford is Stanford, but you can replicate a mini version of that. If you just have the guts to do it and you want to do it, you can change yourself and change whatever you're working with. There's nobody stopping that kid from going to that reservation in Montana and beating back the federal government. And I always think of her, and she's my answer to that.
Well, Bill, thank you so much for all of your thoughts. You have been involved in so many areas, public sector, private sector, academic sector, and you have contributed much to society today. And I really thank you for all the work you put in for all those years to make life better for everybody, to try to make a difference.
Well, and put children through college.
And that's great.
Thank you very much, Dan. That was
All right.
fun.
Thank you.